Approximately 2,000 years ago, there was a vast empire stretching from the shores of the Mediterranean to the misty hills of Britain, from the hot deserts of Mesopotamia to the cold waters of the Rhine River. The people walking the streets of this empire rejoiced, grieved, went hungry, grew weary, and pursued their dreams just like us. Tonight, we will take a journey into the daily life of the ancient Roman Empire. We will walk along the stone-paved streets leading to the Forum. We will hear the conversations in the baths. We will smell the food being prepared in the villas. It's okay if you fall asleep. But have you ever wondered what a Roman citizen would do first thing in the morning? How was hygiene maintained in a world without toothbrushes? And why did everyone go to the baths in the afternoon? The Roman Empire wasn't just about conquests, emperors, and gladiators. Don't forget to subscribe before you drift off to sleep. If you're ready, let's begin. Behind this colossal structure were millions of ordinary people. Slaves and free people, rich and poor, Roman citizens and barbarians. Each had their own unique life, routine, and daily struggles. Tonight, we'll first examine a Roman citizen's morning. Then we'll head to the Forum at the heart of the city, then to the baths, and finally to the evening feasts. Along the way, we'll also look at the lives of slaves, the status of women, the education of children, and the city's dark streets. But where did they start? How did a Roman's day begin? As the sun rose in Rome, the city slowly began to wake up. Of course, we didn't have modern alarm clocks. People woke up with the sunlight, the sounds from the street, or the gentle nudges of their slaves. A wealthy Roman citizen probably lived in a large villa or a multi-story apartment building in the city center, called a domus. These houses were built around inward-facing courtyards. The rooms were kept quiet and cool, but for the poor, the situation was very different. They lived in multi-story apartment blocks called insulae. These buildings were usually 4 stories high and quite crowded. The walls were thin, the risk of fire was high, and the noise was incessant. What was the first thing a Roman did when they woke up in the morning? They didn't have toothbrushes. But hygiene was still important. Various mixtures were used for oral hygiene. Some used urine. Yes, you heard right. The ammonia in urine was an effective substance for cleaning teeth. Of course, this was not the job of the rich. It was the job of the slaves. Washing the face was also simple. A little water and maybe some olive oil. Soap was not yet common. Olive oil was used for both cleaning and skin care. The Romans rubbed this oil on their bodies. Then they scraped it off with a metal scraper called a strigil. This method removed both dirt and excess oil. The dressing process was also interesting. The basic garment in Rome was the tunic, a sleeveless or short-sleeved robe that reached down to the knees. Both men and women wore tunics. But for a Roman citizen, the toga was indispensable. The toga was a large piece of fabric in the shape of a semicircle that only Roman citizens could wear. This fabric was wrapped around the body in a special way, and wearing it correctly was an art. Usually, a slave would assist. The toga was heavy, restricted movement, and was quite uncomfortable in hot weather, but it was a status symbol. A senator would wear a toga with purple stripes. Ordinary citizens wore a white. Children wore a toga praetexta with purple edges until they reached adulthood. Women wore a long garment called a stola. They would drape a shawl called a palla over it. Married women's hair was usually carefully put up in a bun, decorated, and sometimes supported with hairpieces. Hair styling was an important task for slave women. Wealthy women would sit in front of a mirror for hours in the morning, have their hair done, apply makeup, and put on jewelry. Makeup materials came from natural sources. Chalk was used to whiten the skin, red earth to blush the cheeks, and coal for eye makeup. There was also lead-based white powder, but this was a toxic substance and caused skin damage over time. Once the morning preparations were complete, it was time for breakfast, but breakfast in Rome was very simple. This meal, called ion, usually consisted of bread, cheese, olives, dried figs, and a little wine or diluted wine. The wealthy could add honey, eggs, and meat, but for most people, breakfast was a quick and light snack. The main meal was dinner. After breakfast, a Roman citizen would go to work. But what kind of work was there? The wealthy generally did not have to work. They earned income from their land, slaves, or commercial investments. But they still had social and political duties, such as going to the forum, meeting with clients, attending the Senate, or practicing law in court. Roman society was based on patronage. A wealthy patron provided protection, support, and sometimes money to the poor. In return, clients would go to their patron's house in the morning, pay their respects, and show their political support. This morning visit was called the salutatio. Ordinary citizens worked in various professions. There were artisans, merchants, craftsmen, construction workers, bath attendants, bakers, butchers, shoemakers, weavers, potters, and many other professions. The city of Rome was a huge economic machine. Every day, thousands of people walked the streets, shopping, bargaining, and doing business. The streets were narrow, paved with stone, and crowded. Horses, donkeys, crowds of people, stalls, street vendors, beggars, thieves, all kinds of people and animals were intermingled here. The noise was deafening. Vendors shouted, blacksmiths hammered, carts creaked, dogs barked, children screamed. There was no such thing as silence in Rome. Now an interesting question arises. How was hygiene maintained in such a crowded city? Where was the trash thrown? How did the toilets work? The answer is both impressive and a little disturbing. The city of Rome had the most advanced water and sewage system of its time. Aqueducts brought fresh water from miles away. This water flowed into fountains, baths, the villas of the wealthy, and even some public toilets. A drainage system called the Cloaca Maxima discharged wastewater into the Tiber River. But even so, the city was not completely clean. Garbage accumulated in the narrow streets. Sometimes people threw filth out of their windows. You had to be careful when walking. Public toilets were called latrina and were quite interesting places. They were social spaces. Yes, you heard right. Romans did not prefer to go to the toilet alone. Latrinas were long stone benches with holes lined up side by side. People would sit side by side, relieve themselves, and chat at the same time. Socializing was more important than privacy. For cleaning, they used a stick called a tersorium, which had a sponge on the end. This sponge was rinsed in a trough where water flowed and then reused. It was a method far removed from our modern toilet paper, but it worked. In the late morning, we headed towards the Forum, the heart of the city. The Roman Forum was one of the most important squares in the ancient world. It was not just a marketplace. The Forum was surrounded by magnificent temples, basilicas, monuments, and statues. It was a symbol of Rome's power, wealth, and culture. In the mornings, the Forum was extremely crowded. Senators hurried along in their togas. Lawyers argued with their clients. Merchants sold their wares. Vendors shouted. On one side, a religious ceremony was taking place. On the other, A political speech was being listened to. In one corner of the forum was a platform called the rostra. This was where orators and politicians addressed the public. During the Roman Republic, historic speeches were made here. Cicero's famous speeches were heard here. During the Empire, emperors addressed the public here. Another important structure in the forum was the basilica. The basilica was a large, covered hall that hosted court hearings and commercial meetings. Here, lawyers defended their cases, judges made decisions, and business deals were made. The Basilica Julia and the Basilica Aemilia were the largest structures in the forum. The interior was decorated with columns, the ceiling was high, and the acoustics were excellent. Walking through the forum, you would see all kinds of people around you. Senators in white togas, centurions in military uniforms, ordinary citizens in simple clothes, chained slaves, foreign merchants, beggars, and children. Rome was a cosmopolitan city. People from every corner of the empire lived here. Greeks, Egyptians, Syrians, Jews, Gauls, Germans, Africans. Each spoke their own language and maintained their own traditions. But they were all united under the Roman umbrella. Latin was the common language. Roman laws bound everyone, and the emperor was everyone's master. The forum also had great religious significance. There were many temples here. The Temple of Vesta was where the sacred fire burned. The priestesses of Vesta were called Vestals and were women who had taken a vow of chastity. Their duty was to keep the sacred fire burning without ever letting it go out. If the fire went out, it was considered a sign of great disaster for Rome. The Temple of Saturn was where the state treasury was kept. The Temple of Jupiter was located on Capitoline Hill and was considered Rome's most important religious center. Ceremonies were held regularly in the temples, sacrifices were made, and prayers were offered to the gods. Religion was an integral part of daily life for the Romans. Around noon, the temperature began to rise. Because Rome had a Mediterranean climate, summers were quite hot. People sought shade, rested by the fountains, or returned to their homes. Lunch was called prandum and was again a light meal. Cold meat, bread, fruit, cheese, and wine. The rich ate at home, while the poor bought food sold on the streets. There were many restaurants in Rome called Popina and Termopolium. These were similar to today's fast food restaurants. There were large pots on the counter, and ready-made meals were sold inside them. People would buy food here, eat it on the street, or sit on a nearby bench and eat their meal. In the afternoon, Rome's favorite activity began. It was bath time. Romans loved the baths. It wasn't just for cleanliness. It was also for socializing, relaxation, exercise, and entertainment. Large baths called thermae were located in various parts of the city. Some of the most famous were the baths of Caracalla and the baths of Diocletian. These structures were enormous complexes. Inside, there were hot, warm, and cold pools, steam rooms, exercise areas, massage rooms, gardens, libraries, and even restaurants. Entering the baths was very cheap. Sometimes it was even free. This meant that the baths were accessible to everyone. Rich and poor, free and slave, everyone could go to the same baths. Of course, the rich had their own private baths, but the public baths were much more popular. When you entered the bath, you would first undress and leave your clothes in a room. Then you would go from the changing room, called the apoditerium, to the exercise area, called the palestra. Here, people would wrestle, lift weights, or play ball games. After sweating, you would enter a room called the caldarium, where the hot water was. There were large pools and bathtubs here. The water was very hot, almost scalding. You would then move to a warm room called the tepidarium, where your body would gradually cool down. Finally, you would enter the frigidarium, a cold water pool. Diving into this cold water closed the pores and had a revitalizing effect. The time spent in the baths was measured in hours. People did not rush. They chatted with friends, had massages, applied oils, and scraped themselves with a strigil. Some wealthy individuals hired private masseurs. Perfumes and oils were used. Baths were centers of gossip. Political discussions, business deals, introductions, flirting, everything happened here. Baths were also cultural centers where books were read in libraries. Poets recited their works, philosophers engaged in debates. Some baths even had art galleries and sculpture collections. The technical infrastructure of the baths was also quite impressive. A heating system called hypocaust was used. In this system, an empty space was left under the floor, and hot air was sent there. This hot air heated the floor and walls. Large furnaces were used to heat the water. Slaves constantly carried wood, fed the fires, and kept the water warm. Aqueducts were used for water supply. Rome's aqueducts were engineering marvels. They brought fresh water from miles away and distributed it throughout the city. This water reached not only the baths but also fountains, villas, and public toilets. After leaving the baths, it was time for dinner. The evening meal, called cena, was the most important meal of the day. For wealthy families, cena was not just about eating. It was a social event, a spectacle, a status symbol. Being invited to an evening meal at the home of a wealthy Roman citizen elevated your social standing. These feasts could last for hours, with numerous dishes served and wine flowing freely. The meal took place in a dining room called the triclinium. Guests reclined on couches, eating while propped up on their elbows. Each couch seated 3 people, which is why the room was called the triclinium. The meals consisted of several courses. First came the starters, called Gustavo. These included olives, eggs, seafood, vegetables, and various appetizers. Then came the main courses, called mensae primae. Meat, fish, poultry, game, and even wild animals could be served. Peacocks, flamingos, wild boars, deer, rabbits, mussels, fish, and many other dishes were served with sauces. The Romans loved a fish sauce called garum. This sauce was made from salted and fermented fish and was added to almost every dish. Finally, desserts called mensa secunda were served. Cakes, fruits, honey, sweet pastries, and cheese. Wine was drunk during the meal. But the Romans never drank wine neat. They mixed it with water. Sometimes they added honey and spices. Drinking pure wine was considered barbaric. The wine was mixed in a large vessel called a wine cup and served from there into goblets. While drinking, conversations took place, stories were told, poems were read, music was played, and sometimes dances were performed. Wealthy hosts could hire musicians, dancers, acrobats, and even gladiators to impress their guests. The topics of conversation during meals varied. Politics, literature, philosophy, gossip, trade, military news. Romans loved to talk, and being a good speaker was a very important skill. At some banquets, debates took place, and sometimes jokes were exchanged. Dining was a communal experience. Wealthy Romans went to great lengths to display luxury at their banquets. Food was served on silver plates. Precious goblets were used. Rare foods were served and expensive perfumes were sprayed. The house was decorated with mosaics, frescoes, and statues. Attending a banquet meant observing the host's wealth, taste, and social power. But for the poor, dinner was much simpler. Most of the time, it was soup cooked at home, some bread, and water. Bread was a staple food in Rome. The state distributed grain to the Roman people for free or at a very low price. This system was called the annona and ensured that the people did not go hungry. Bread was the staple food of the poor. From morning to night, it was bread, olives, a little cheese, and water. Meat was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. An ordinary Roman citizen might eat meat once a month. Fish was a little more affordable, but it was still not something to be eaten every day. After dinner, night fell. There was nightlife in Rome, but it was not like in our modern cities. The streets were dark because there were no street lamps. People walked carrying torches or lanterns carried by their slaves. The streets became dangerous at night. Thieves, bandits, and drunks roamed around. The rich did not go out at night. If they did, they had guards with them. Night was the time of the poor, their slaves, and shady dealings. Some taverns and poppins remained open at night. Here, people gambled, drank wine, and sometimes fought. Night watchmen were called vigiles and patrolled the city. Their job was to extinguish fires and maintain public order. Because the insulae, made of wood, were always at high risk of fire. Now it's time to look at the lives of slaves. The Roman Empire was built on a slave economy. It was impossible to imagine Rome without slaves. Approximately 1/3 or more of the empire's population were slaves. Slaves were people who had been taken prisoner in wars, kidnapped by pirates, or fallen into slavery because of debt. A slave's life depended entirely on the mercy of his master. Some masters treated their slaves well and regarded them as family. Others were cruel. They beat their slaves, tortured them, and made them work in terrible conditions. Slaves had no legal rights. They were bought and sold like objects. Their masters could punish them or even kill them, and this was legal. The work performed by slaves was very diverse. Those who worked as domestic slaves were fortunate. They cleaned, cooked, and looked after children. Some served as teachers, secretaries, doctors, or accountants. Educated slaves were highly valued, and their masters treated them better. But for slaves working in mines, fields, or construction sites, life was hell. Hard labor, mistreatment, malnutrition, and despair. Some were trained as gladiators. These slaves fought for their lives in the arena, entertaining the public. Being a gladiator was both prestigious and risky. However, slaves could sometimes gain their freedom. In a process called manumission, a master could free his slave. Freed slaves were called libertus and had a certain status in Roman society. Some became wealthy, started businesses, and even acquired slaves of their own. But they were still looked down upon in society because their past as slaves was known. Still, freedom was every slave's dream. If a slave was freed, their children could become full Roman citizens. This demonstrated the dynamic structure of Roman society. The position of women was also an important issue. In Rome, women had fewer rights than men. Women were legally under the guardianship of their fathers or husbands. They could acquire property and engage in trade, but they did not have political rights. They could not vote, sit in the Senate, or serve as judges. However, wealthy and influential women could indirectly intervene in politics. They exerted influence through their husbands, sons, or political connections. Some imperial wives played important roles in Roman politics. Women's daily lives varied according to social class. Wealthy women lived comfortably in their homes. Slaves served them. They visited friends, went to baths, and shopped whenever they wished. But poor women had a much harder life. They did the housework themselves, went to market, looked after their children, and sometimes worked. Some worked as weavers, seamstresses, potters, or bakers. Marriage was usually an arrangement between families. Love marriages were rare. Marriages were arranged for political alliances, economic gain, or social advancement. Girls were usually married at an early age, between 12 and 15. Men married a little later, between 20 and 30. Wedding ceremonies were important events. The bride wore a white tunic, had her hair styled in a special way, and wore a yellow veil. The ceremony was performed in front of witnesses and was followed by a feast. The bride's move to her new home was also a ceremonial event. The bride was carried over the threshold because stumbling would bring bad luck. In married life, a woman's role was to bear children and manage the household. It was important to have many children because the infant mortality rate was high. 1 in 5 children died before reaching the age of 5. Disease, malnutrition, and poor hygiene affected children the most. Childbirth was also dangerous. Many women died during or after childbirth. In an era without modern medical interventions, childbirth was both a source of joy and fear. The experience of midwives was vital. The goddess Juno Lucina was considered the protector of women in labor, and prayers were offered to her. Children's education also varied according to social class. Children from wealthy families were taught by private tutors. These tutors were usually Greek slaves, as the Greeks were considered experts in education. Children learned reading, writing, mathematics, rhetoric, literature, philosophy, and music. Greek and Latin were 2 important languages. A Roman aristocrat had to be fluent in both languages. Memorizing Homer's Iliad and Odyssey was an important part of education. Virgilius' Aeneid was also a masterpiece of Roman literature, and every educated Roman citizen had to know it. Boys stayed with their mothers until the age of 7. Then their education began. When they reached the age of 14, they wore the toga virilis, the adult toga, and were now considered full Roman citizens. This ceremony took place during the Liberalia festival, and families held a big celebration. Young men could now participate in political life, be drafted into the army, or start their careers. Girls, on the other hand, usually remained at home and learned household chores. Daughters of wealthy families could also receive an education, but it was more limited than that of boys. They focused on subjects such as music, dance, and housekeeping. Children from poor families had no opportunity for education. From an early age, they helped their families with their work, labored in the fields, or learned a trade. They were apprenticed to a master craftsman. In this way, they learned trades such as baking, blacksmithing, shoemaking, or pottery. For these children, education meant learning survival skills. Reading and writing were considered a luxury. Although the literacy rate in Rome is not precisely known, it is likely that only 10 to 20% of the population could read and write. The majority had to make do with signs and symbols. Children's games were also interesting. Roman children played games just like children today. They played with balls. They played hide and seek. They threw dice and spent time with their toys. Toys such as small figurines, dolls, cars, and animal figures have been found in archaeological excavations. The toys of rich children were of higher quality. They were made of ivory or bronze. The toys of poor children, on the other hand, were simple things made of wood or clay. But the imagination was the same in every child. The streets were their playground. Tag, wrestling, stone throwing, and races were the most popular games. Now let's change the subject a little and look at Rome's entertainment culture.
The Romans loved entertainment.
Emperors pursued a policy of bread and circuses to keep the people happy.
Panem et circenses, meaning bread and spectacles.
Free grain was distributed and free entertainment was provided. This way, the people did not concern themselves too much with political issues and did not revolt. Entertainment was a means of political control. The most popular forms of entertainment were gladiator fights, chariot races, theater plays, and athletic competitions.
The Colosseum was Rome's most famous entertainment center.
It could hold approximately 50,000 people and was a massive amphitheater. Gladiator fights took place here. Gladiators were usually slaves, prisoners of war, or criminals. They were trained in special schools and specialized in various fighting styles. The retiarius fought with a net and a three-pronged spear. The murmillo fought with a short sword and a large shield. The traches used a curved sword. Each type of gladiator had its own distinctive armor and weapons. The fights were a matter of life and death.
The public loved bloody spectacles.
When a gladiator was defeated, spectators would show their thumbs up or down to determine his fate. Legend has it that showing it down meant eternal death. But historical evidence is unclear. Regardless, gladiatorial combat was extremely popular. Some gladiators became famous. Successful gladiators gained wealth, fame, and sometimes freedom. The public supported them like athletes.
Women fell in love with gladiators.
Graffiti was written on walls. Names were announced. But most gladiators died young. The average gladiator could only fight 10 or 12 times. Some died in their first fight, while others survived for years. The Colosseum wasn't just for gladiator fights. Wild animal hunts were also held. In these spectacles, called venations, lions, tigers, bears, elephants, crocodiles, and other exotic animals were released into the arena and killed by hunters. Thousands of animals were slaughtered in a single show. These shows symbolized Rome's power and the distant lands the empire had reached. Sometimes even naval battles were staged in the arena. In these shows, called naumachii, the arena was filled with water and ships were floated. Gladiators boarded the ships and reenacted naval battles. These massive productions required incredible amounts of money, planning, and manpower. But emperors invested in these shows to impress the public and gain political support. The more spectacular a show an emperor organized, the more he was loved and supported.
There was a complex tunnel system under the Colosseum.
This was called the hypogeum.
Gladiators waited here.
Animals were kept in cages and the stages were prepared. Thanks to elevators and trapdoors, gladiators and animals were suddenly brought out into the arena. This surprised and excited the audience. Another popular entertainment was chariot racing. The Circus Maximus was Rome's largest race track. It could hold approximately 150,000 to 200,000 people. It was much larger than the Colosseum. Chariot races were held between 4 teams: the Reds, the Whites, the Blues, and the Greens. Each team had passionate fans. Fans enthusiastically supported their own team, insulted the opposing teams, and sometimes started fights. Chariot races resembled modern football matches more than a sporting event. The drivers were called aurigas and were usually slaves or freed slaves. A successful driver could gain wealth and fame. Some became millionaires. The races were dangerous. Horses raced in 4s or 6s, and the charioteer tied the reins to his waist. If the chariot overturned, the charioteer could be crushed under the horses or dragged to death. Accidents were common, and the public watched them with excitement. It was popular in the theater, but not as bloody as gladiatorial combat. The Romans developed their own theater by adopting the Greek theatrical tradition. Comedies and tragedies were staged. Sometimes there were musical performances too. But Roman theater gradually became lighter and more entertaining. Pantomimes and mimes were popular. These were silent performances and usually dealt with body, comical, or dramatic subjects. Actors wore masks and made exaggerated movements. The public loved these performances. Some actors became very famous. They were even invited to the palaces of emperors. However, actors had a low social status. They were usually slaves or from the lower classes and were considered immoral. A respectable Roman citizen could not be an actor, but theater was still an important part of cultural life. Many plays were staged during festivals, and the public watched for free. The theater buildings were amphitheaters in the shape of a semicircle with excellent acoustics. People sat on stone steps, and the stage was a large platform. The sets, costumes, and masks were quite detailed. There were also athletic competitions. Athletics, wrestling, boxing, and running competitions were held. But these were not as prestigious as the Olympic Games in Greece. The Romans placed more importance on martial arts and practical skills. Military training was very important for young men. A Roman citizen had to be prepared for military service. Soldiers were constantly needed to protect the empire's borders, suppress rebellions, and carry out conquests. Military service was both a duty and a matter of honor. The Roman army was the most advanced military force of its time. Discipline, training, and organization were of the highest standard. Legions consisted of approximately 5,000 soldiers. Each legion was divided into smaller units called centuries. Centurions were the backbone of the legions. They were experienced, tough, and disciplined commanders. Military training was rigorous. Soldiers trained every day. They learned marching, weapon use, setting up camp, building fortifications, and war strategies. Roman soldiers were not just warriors. They were also engineers, builders, and road builders. Roman roads, aqueducts, and bridges were built by soldiers. Military service lasted 25 years. During this long period, soldiers served on the borders, participated in wars, and were stationed in various parts of the empire. After completing their service, they retired and were given land or money. Retired soldiers were settled in new colonies, thus spreading Roman culture throughout the empire. Military discipline was very strict. Disobedience resulted in severe punishment. Desertion was punishable by death. Units that showed cowardice were subjected to a punishment called decimatio. In this punishment, 1 soldier out of every 10 in the unit was selected by lottery and beaten to death by the other soldiers. This brutal method was intended to enforce discipline. But soldiers fought not only with discipline but also with motivation. After victory, the spoils were shared. Successful commanders gave bonuses to their soldiers. Furthermore, becoming a Roman citizen brought prestige to soldiers. Military success offered opportunities for social advancement. A centurion had a much higher status than an ordinary peasant. Military careers were an important route for social mobility. War booty was an important part of the Roman economy. Gold, silver, grain, slaves, and valuables from conquered lands were brought to Rome. This wealth supported the empire's growth but also fed the slave system. Each new conquest meant thousands of new slaves. Religious life was also an integral part of daily life in Rome. The Romans were polytheistic, meaning they believed in many gods. Jupiter was the chief god, the god of thunder and rain. Juno was the goddess of marriage and the protector of women. Mars was the god of war and was considered the father of Romulus, the founder of Rome. Venus was the goddess of love and beauty. Mercury was the god of commerce and travelers. Minerva was the goddess of wisdom and crafts. Each god had his own temple, priest, and rituals. Religion was a matter of state. Emperors held the title of Pontifex Maximus, or High Priest. Performing religious duties was part of political power.
Religion was everywhere in daily life.
Small shrines in homes were called larariums. Here, prayers were offered to the household gods, the Lares and Penates. Every morning, the head of the family would offer small sacrifices, pour wine, or burn incense. Before important decisions were made, the gods were consulted. Oracles were interpreted by priests called augurs. The flight of birds, the internal organs of animals, or natural events were seen as messages from the gods. These prophecies influenced everything from decisions about war to choices about marriage. Religious festivals were held throughout the year. Saturnalia was one of the most popular festivals. It was celebrated in December and lasted a week. During this festival, social roles were reversed. Slaves could behave like their masters, attend feasts, and enjoy themselves freely. Gifts were exchanged. The streets were filled with celebrations. Saturnalia was a source of joy and hope in the darkness of winter. There were other festivals as well. Lupercalia was a festival of fertility and purification. Young men would run through the city, lightly whipping women with rods. This ritual was believed to increase fertility. The Vestalia was a festival dedicated to the goddess Vesta, and housewives participated in it specifically. The Floralia was a festival of spring and flowers and was celebrated with quite obscene performances. Each festival had its own rituals, sacrifices, and entertainment. Religion was the glue that held society together. Shared beliefs, shared ceremonies, and shared values ensured Rome's unity. But over time, Rome's religious structure changed. As the empire expanded, gods from different cultures were added to the Roman pantheon. The Egyptian goddess Isis, the god Mithras, Syrian gods, and many others were worshipped in Rome. The Roman religion was flexible and inclusive. New gods were accepted, and local beliefs were respected. But there was one exception: the imperial cult. Emperors were declared gods after their death. Sometimes they were even worshipped as gods while still alive. This cult was a sign of political loyalty. Worshipping the emperor demonstrated your allegiance to Rome. This was a mandatory ritual, and refusal was treason. The rise of Christianity changed this dynamic. In the early centuries, Christianity was a small and persecuted minority. Christians suffered persecution because they refused to worship the emperor. They were thrown to lions in the Colosseum, executed, and tortured. But Christianity slowly spread. It became popular, especially among the lower classes, slaves, and women. This was because Christianity promised equality, love, and salvation. It offered an alternative to Rome's rigid social hierarchy. In the 4th century, Emperor Constantine legalized Christianity. Christianity later became the official religion of the empire. This was a revolutionary change in Rome's religious and cultural structure. Now let's look at another aspect of daily life: health and medicine. Life expectancy in Rome was short. Most people died between the ages of 40 and 50. Infant mortality was very high. 2 out of 5 children did not reach the age of 5. Infections, epidemics, malnutrition, and accidents caused the greatest loss of life. There were no modern antibiotics, vaccines, or surgical techniques. Medicine was based on both scientific and magical beliefs. Roman medicine was greatly influenced by Greek medicine. The teachings of Greek physicians such as Hippocrates and Galen were also applied in Rome. Physicians believed in the theory of 4 bodily fluids: black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Illnesses were caused by an imbalance of these fluids. Treatment methods varied. Herbal medicines, dietary changes, bloodletting, emesis, and enemas were common. Bloodletting was particularly popular. It was believed that removing excess blood from the body would restore balance. Surgeons could treat fractures, stitch wounds, and sometimes perform simple surgeries. But anesthesia was limited. Opium and alcohol were used as painkillers but were insufficient. Surgeries were extremely painful and carried a high risk of infection. Military doctors were experienced in treating war wounds. They could remove arrows, stop bleeding, and clean wounds. But complications were common, and many soldiers died from their injuries. Baths were important for health. Regular washing reduced the risk of infection. Hot water relaxed muscles and improved blood circulation. Massages reduce tension in the body and support overall health. The Romans believed in the therapeutic properties of baths. Baths were recommended for rheumatism, joint pain, and skin diseases. Thermal springs were particularly popular. Springs believed to have healing waters, such as aqua sulis, became centers visited by patients. Temples were built here and thanks were given to the gods. Dental health was also problematic. Since sugar was rare, cavities were not as common as they are today. But gum disease, broken teeth, and tooth loss were common. Dentists could extract decayed teeth and sometimes make gold or ivory prostheses. Herbal mixtures were used as painkillers, but their effectiveness was limited. Having a tooth pulled meant unbearable pain. Glasses had not yet been invented. Vision problems began with old age. But there was not much that could be done about it. Some wealthy people used water-filled glass spheres as magnifying glasses for reading, but this was not common. Epidemics were one of Rome's greatest enemies. Crowded cities, poor hygiene, and travel caused diseases to spread rapidly. Major epidemics such as the Antonine Plague and the Cyprian Plague had caused the loss of millions of lives. During these epidemics, cities were paralyzed, the economy collapsed, and social order broke down. People feared the wrath of the gods, sacrificed animals, and prayed. But without knowledge of microbes and contagion, stopping epidemics was nearly impossible. Old age was a privilege enjoyed by a fortunate few. A Roman citizen who reached the age of 60 was respected. The elderly were consulted, and their experience was valued. Older members of the Senate carried more weight than younger ones. Within the family, the elderly were also the authority.
De pater familias, the head of the family, held authority until his last breath.
An elderly father had a say even in the lives of his adult sons. But old age also brought difficulties. Loss of strength, illness, and dependency. Old age was more comfortable for the wealthy, as slaves cared for them. The poor, however, were dependent on their children or the mercy of society. Death was an inevitable fact of life, and the Romans were prepared for it. Funeral rites were important. For the wealthy, funerals became grand spectacles. The body was washed, dressed in fine clothes, and displayed at home for several days. Lamentations were sung, and professional mourners were hired. The funeral procession passed through the streets and went to the cemetery. Musicians played, relatives wept, and masks of ancestors were carried. The ancestors of wealthy families were represented by wax masks and displayed at funeral ceremonies. This demonstrated the family's nobility and history. The body was usually cremated. Cremation was a common practice. The body was burned in a funeral pyre. The ashes were collected and placed in an urn. This urn was placed in the family tomb or in communal cemeteries called columbariums. Some wealthy individuals commissioned magnificent tomb monuments. The sides of main roads, such as the Appian Way, were lined with magnificent tombs. These tombs conveyed the deceased's wealth, achievements, and social status. Epitaphs inscribed on tombstones summarized the person's life. Some were serious and formal, while others were humorous and sincere. There was a belief in life after death, but it was not clear-cut. The underworld, the realm of the dead, was where the dead went. A ferryman named Charon carried souls across the river Styx. He charged a fee in return. For this reason, a coin was placed in the mouth of the corpse. The fate of souls in the underworld was uncertain. Some rested in a happy place called Elysium. Others were punished in Tartarus. But these beliefs were not as systematic as Christianity. Most Romans approached the afterlife with skepticism because they did not know exactly what it entailed. Rome's economy was based on trade.
The empire was a vast trading network.
The Mediterranean was a Roman lake. Ships carried grain, olive oil, wine, spices, silk, precious stones, and slaves. Egypt was Rome's granary. Every year, large quantities of wheat came from Egypt to Rome. This grain was vital for feeding the people. If the grain ships were delayed, there was a risk of famine and rebellion in the city. Therefore, the state strictly controlled the grain supply. Trade was conducted via sea and land routes. Roman roads were engineering marvels. They were flat, wide, and sturdy. Caravan transport was used for the movement of the army and postal services. The state postal system, called the cursus publicus, delivered messages throughout the empire. Caravanserais were located at regular intervals along the road, and travelers would stay here. Trade also offered opportunities for ordinary citizens. A successful merchant could become wealthy and rise in society. But there were risks too. Ships could sink, pirates could attack, and roads could be raided by bandits. Marketplaces were considered the heart of the city. All kinds of goods were sold here. Vegetables, fruits, meat, fish, bread, wine, olive oil, woven fabrics, shoes, jewelry, ceramics, glassware, and much more were commonly traded. Prices were not fixed, and customers would bargain to get better deals. Sellers would shout, praise their goods, and try to attract customers. Fraud was also common. Rigged scales, counterfeit goods, and scams were frequently seen. Therefore, buyers had to be careful. Coins were the foundation of the economy. Rome had developed a standard monetary system. Gold, silver, and bronze coins were used. The denarius was the most common silver coin. The sestertius was a bronze coin used for everyday purchases. The aureus was a gold coin and was used for large sums. The coins bore the emperor's face and propaganda messages. These coins spread throughout the empire and symbolized Rome's power. Banking also existed. Bankers called argentarii offered money changing, lending, and deposit services. Interest rates could be high, and debt was a dangerous trap. People who couldn't pay their debts could fall into slavery or lose their property. Taxation was necessary for the empire to function. Citizens and provinces paid various taxes: land taxes, customs duties, sales taxes, and special taxes. Collecting taxes was the job of tax collectors called publicani. These people were generally hated because they took too much tax from the people and lined their own pockets. The tax burden was particularly heavy in the provinces. Roman citizens were exempt from some taxes, but the people of the provinces paid for everything. Now we are approaching the end of our long journey. Daily life in the ancient Roman Empire was a rich and complex experience. From waking up with the sun in the morning to feasts in the evening, from walking in the forum to relaxing in the baths, every day held thousands of stories, thousands of lives, and thousands of emotions. Rome was not just monuments made of stone. It was a world where people lived, loved, suffered, and pursued their dreams. Slaves and free people, rich and poor, men and women were all part of this vast structure. The Romans left us many things: their legal systems, engineering knowledge, architectural works, literature, philosophy, and language. Latin still forms the basis of many languages today. Roman roads are still used in some places. Roman law is considered the ancestor of modern legal systems. But perhaps the most important legacy is our understanding of human nature. Like us, the Romans sought happiness, wanted security, and questioned meaning. Even 2,000 years later, their stories resonate with us.
Tonight we walked the stone-paved streets of Rome. We got lost in the crowds of the Forum.
We relaxed in the warm waters of the baths and drank wine at evening feasts. We watched the gladiators' displays of courage. We heard children playing in the streets and listened to the stories of the elderly. Each was a piece of the mosaic of this magnificent empire. And now perhaps your eyes are closed. Perhaps you are wandering through the dreams of Rome. Perhaps you are speaking in the forum as a Roman. Perhaps you are chatting with friends in the baths. The Roman Empire fell, but its legacy lives on. We see Rome in every historical building, every legal text, every Latin-derived word, and every day when the sun rises, just like a Roman did 2,000 years ago, we wake up and continue living our lives. Humanity changes, but at its core, it remains the same. Love, fear, hope, and dreams are timeless. Dear viewer, we have reached the end of this long journey. I hope this narrative has satisfied your curiosity and given you a peaceful night. Together, we explored the magnificent world of Rome. If you have listened this far, I am grateful to you. If you have already fallen asleep, then I have completed my task. Ancient Rome will continue to live on not only in history books but also in our imagination. In the next video, we will be back with another story from the depths of history.
Until then, good night and sweet dreams.
Continue to walk peacefully on the stone-paved roads of Rome.